Please welcome from Seattle, Washington, the amazing Matt Cameron.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. I was very excited to receive a text from Geddy asking me to host tonight's appearance. And you know, like you, I'm a lifelong Rush fan. Rush came into my life in 1976. I was 14 years old, living in San Diego, and some neighborhood buddies of mine had a little record called 2112. You guys ever heard of that record? Yeah. There was so much to digest. The music was so dense. There was so much to digest for me as a young kid, a young, drummer, 14-year-old kid, and my love for the band just continued over the years, and I got to know them a little bit when I first started venturing out on my own in the 90s, I got to work with Geddy on his solo album, My Favorite Headache, which was a career highlight for me. And I guess a big takeaway for me as a musician is just how warm and open-hearted these guys were, and what incredible musicians they are and were. So hey, I would like to introduce to the stage one of the greatest bass players who's ever existed, Mr. Geddy Lee.
Thank you for being here. Hi. You're marvelous looking, I must say. Beautiful. A devilish looking fellow, I must say. Happy to be here. I'm happy to be here with my friend Matt. As he said, we made a record together, which was a big moment for me because I had never done a solo album before. And of course, I was looking for the right drummer, and I just had one drummer in mind, and it was you, dude.
Wow.
Right?
Well, thank you. It was just one of those moments, as a musician where you're offered this opportunity to make music with one of your all-time heroes, and you just say yes. I mean, you say yes immediately, and you just make it all happen. I hadn't really worked with Geddy before that, and we didn't spend a whole lot of time together, so it was
but it was so awesome because I came to Seattle and to record your drums there with Adam Casper.
That's right.
Who's a great engineer, part of that whole Seattle scene. And everyone was so effing nice to me. I mean, what I noticed immediately was that I checked into the hotel, it was all young people that looked like they were probably musicians working at the hotel.
Right, in a band,
and they were. Yes. Everyone in Seattle seemed to be a musician, so it was a very welcoming atmosphere, and you guys were great.
Thank you.
And you played so well, and we were too well because we were out of there too quickly. But anyway, great result, and I'm happy to be here with you tonight.
Oh, man, thank you so much. It's an absolute honor.
Yeah, thank you. Shall we sit and talk?
No. Well, have you all read this amazing book, myeffinlife, by Geddy Lee? It's an incredible journey through your life as a young kid, growing up in Toronto, and I guess, I would like to start at the beginning of that journey. You know, your parents' love story, how they came together in the most extreme conditions imaginable, was really inspiring, and the way that you told it in your book is amazing. You know, one thing in the book that you mentioned was like this idea of survivor's guilt that you talked about. Were there any like adults outside of your family unit that you guys could, you know, share your feelings with? I know, like in today's climate, like kids have access to a lot more mental health professionals.
Yeah, not then, no.
Not then.
No,
yeah.
no.
Yeah.
None of the adults in my family really considered my mental health at all. You know, it was a different time. I grew up in a household that was quite religious. You know, it was a Jewish household, and my grandmother lived with us, and she was, you know, very orthodox, and they had all survived by the skin of their teeth after 6 years of incarceration in concentration camps in Poland and Germany. So it was a happy environment because the fact that they came to a new world. They left the old, you know, the cinders and the ashes of the old world in World War II behind them to start a new life in Canada. And the reason they came to Canada was my dad had a sister that lived there, so that drew them to Toronto. And it was a fairly normal life. And then, of course, my mother was the one that was very vocal, telling us stories about what she had endured during the war. My dad never talked about that stuff. And when you talk to other children of survivors, there really are those two camps. You've got some parents that just won't talk about it, and then you have parents that don't stop talking about it. And that was my mom. She wanted us to know everything, all those horrible stories. And honest to God, it gave us nightmares. It gave me nightmares. And I often think that that wouldn't be allowed today, you know. But she wanted us to understand. She wanted us to get a sense of how lucky we were to be there and through what she had survived. So, and so after, you know, many years later, of course, I wanted, as I was putting this book together, I decided that we had all these disparate stories from uncles, aunts, and there was no real document that I could leave behind for my family or for, you know, whoever else might be interested in that period of what happened. So I spent a lot of time researching, you know, reading books, watching films, and it was remarkable because there's an incredible amount of data on the Shoah Foundation. There's interviews, and some of them were with members of my family, you know. So I could corroborate my mom's story and outline exactly what they went through. And I just thought, considering the times we're living in, you know, it's not a bad thing to reinforce that this is something that did happen, and we should be aware that it could happen again, you know. So when the witnesses are all getting too old and starting to leave the planet, somebody has to remind us of what transpired in that period. So I felt it was.
You write about it beautifully. Can you talk a little bit about when you first met Alex?
With pleasure.
Yeah. It seems like you guys met as friends first, and then you sort of developed this kinship through music and your desires and aspirations to start bands and whatnot. Did you have a kinship immediately with Alex?
Well, this is the story. So I lived in a sort of suburb that was primarily a Jewish suburb, brand new build, right, all new homes. And we got bused to a junior high school. That's what we have in Canada, these junior highs. And it was really kind of a terrible situation because you know, they weren't used to having people of our persuasion in the neighborhood. So when the bus arrived, there were people, kids, bullies, I guess you could say, that were waiting for this busload of people, and we would get taunted and jeered, and fights would break out and stuff. And so I was pretty much a loner through that period. And then I met this guy who befriended me, and he was considered very, very cool because he was an athlete, you know. But he was the kind of athlete that, you know, and when I say athlete in Canada, I mean a hockey player. Of course, we really are only sport, let's face it. So he was a hockey player, and he was much admired because of that. And in the summer, when he wasn't playing hockey, he'd grow his hair long, and he was a freak. And I was trying to grow my hair long, so somehow he gravitated to me. Anyway, and because of my friendship with him, people left me alone, and that was a real blessing, I can tell you. And so he kept talking to me. We both decided to pick up the bass at the same time. By the way, his name was Steve Shutt, and he played for the Montreal Canadiens, and in fact, he became a huge hockey star. I say that name in Canada, and people just freak out. But here, I guess a little, you know, different vibes. It's okay. Steve's not insulted. I'll be sure. Anyway, he knew this guy named Alex Zhivuyinovich. And Alex was a guitar player. And so Steve and I both used to go to concerts together, and we picked up a bass. We both wanted to be bass players because we went to see this one band, a Toronto band called the Mandela. And the bass player was this guy named Denny Gerard, and he was really effing good. So we were both so impressed, we both bought bass guitars. Well, it didn't work out too well for him, but thankfully for me, it did. So he kept saying, you gotta meet this guy, Alex Zhivuyinovich, he's a guitar player. And it turned out that he was good friends with him, so he introduced us. And if it wasn't for Steve, I would never have met Al. And we changed schools the next year because they opened a school closer to us, and guess who was sitting beside me in class? This Serbian goofball, Alex Zhivuyinovich. And you're right, we hit it off like that. And we had the same kind of goofy sense of humor, and we both loved music, and we didn't play in a band together yet. That would come in a little while, but we really hit it off. And started writing each other's exams. Yeah, we weren't very good students. But, and of course, you know, I'm still hanging around with him today, so I guess I have no imagination.
Yeah, lifelong friend.
But that's how we got started. And one day, he called me up and said, our bass player's not showing up for this gig, would you fill in? And I said, of course. Sure, I'd love to. And they were playing this little coffee house in the basement of a church. And I went, and we rehearsed about 6 or 7 songs. I mean, we had very little gear. I had an amp, and that's usually why Alex called me, was to borrow my amp. But I remember the microphone, we had no mic stand, so we would tape the mic to like a lamp like that.
Yeah, sure.
And I would sing into this lamp all night. And we played a bunch of Cream songs, and we just hit it off. And the next day, he asked me to be a permanent member of the band. So that's how I got started in Rush. Yeah.
Dusty Coconuts, was that was one of your first?
That was one of my early bands.
Yeah.
Dusty Coconuts, The Aquiline Dimension of the Mind.
Good name.
The Blueberry Hyena Underwater. Very San Francisco inspired.
Good name. And you went to play the Toronto bar band circuit.
Eventually, yeah.
Eventually, yeah.
Eventually, we got into the bars. But
which eventually led to forming Rush, which was a 4-piece at one point.
At one point, we started as a 3-piece. That day I tried out for them. We remained a 3-piece for a while, and then we added a 4th piece. And then they kicked me out.
Yeah.
Yeah, they kicked me out of the band. So I was walking to rehearsal, and poor Lindy was our keyboard player. His name was Lindy Young. And he was the nicest guy in the band. And of course they made him do it. And so he's walking across this field, I'm walking across the field, and I see him, I go, Lynn, what are you doing here? He goes, well, good. And he's looking down to the ground because he's lying. Oh, good, you know, the band broke up. The band broke up. What the fuck? What do you mean the band? I wasn't informed about this. Well, you know, they told me to tell you. Anyway, I was shocked. I didn't know what to think. I went home. I tried to get a hold of Alex. Of course, I couldn't. And so next day, I just started another band and was playing around the circuit. And they formed a band called Hadrian with this bass player that looked really cool, but he couldn't really fucking play at all. So, how's that going to work for you? So here's a goofy story. So I wanted to hear what this new band sounded like, but I had tickets to this concert, and I was kind of torn. Well, I kept thinking, well, I'll see this concert another time. You know, this guy will be back in town, but I have to be at their first gig. So I sold the tickets, and they were for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. What an idiot. So instead of seeing Jimi Hendrix, I go see this band, and of course they were terrible. And the bass player was terrible, which made me kind of happy, actually. And, you know, they lasted 2 gigs, and that was it. And so within a few months, I get a phone call from John Rutsey, the drummer, and he invited me back into the band. And, you know, I've told this story to people, and they say, why did you go back? And I said, there's only 2 words, Alex Lifeson.
Oh.
And I wanted to play with him. I love the guy. First of all, he's the funniest person you'll ever meet in your life. And secondly, he's a great guitar player. Anyway, that's how we reformed, and then we took off from there.
And in the book, it talks about Alex was just going with the flow during that firing, and
I never asked him.
Yeah.
I never asked him if he was one of the guys responsible for me getting kicked out. I didn't ask him until last year. I invited him to my house, and I said, I want to interview you for my book. Yeah. And I put him in the fucking hot seat. And I said, Al, I never asked you this question. Whose idea was it? You were well good, you know. You know me, I'll just go with the flow kind of guy. Of course, he blamed everything on John because John had passed away. He couldn't defend himself. But anyway, I forgive him. It's fine.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you guys worked that out finally after all these years. You know, another part in the book, in the early development of Rush, you guys, you talked about the importance of, you know, power trios, British power trios, Cream, The Who, and, you know, the importance of Led Zeppelin in your musical development. I know how important they were in my early stages of becoming a musician. Can you just talk about the importance of Zepp in your...
Yeah, well, I mean, early on we were fans of a lot of the British blues bands, like John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. You know, they always had great musicians. Eric Clapton played with that band. What's his name? He went on to play with the Stones for a while. Great guitars. He always had superb guitar players. And then, of course, we loved Cream. It was our favorite band, and I was a huge Jack Bruce fan. He was very influential. But John had seen this band come through town before their first album had come out, called Led Zeppelin. And he'd seen them at this small club. Sort of like, I guess it wasn't a club, but it was a place a bit smaller than this. Maybe 3/4 the size. Anyway, and he came back to us just raving about them. So they came back that September. And it's a concert I'll never forget because I had to pawn I had to pawn my typewriter that my grandmother had given me for my birthday, and I never told her that. But I had no money. I wanted to see Zepp, man. It's like I had to get the cash. So the three of us lined up before the show, and we went in, and we sat in the second row. And my God, I mean, that's a concert that changed my life. I don't think Jimmy Page walked out on the stage. I'm sure he floated out on a cloud. And he was wearing, I think, a purple suit, and he was playing Train Kept a Rollin'. They opened the show with Train Kept a Rollin', like sort of blues classic. But it changed our focus completely. Now we had to be like Led Zeppelin. We had to be heavier. Right. And that cost us Lindy, who was still playing keyboards for us. He didn't agree with that vibe, so he left the band then, and we were a trio again. So they were hugely impactful and really helped focus us on the kind of band we wanted to be.
Well, I would like to fast forward to 1974. You guys were at a little bit of a crossroads with John Rutsey. You and Alex were trying to expand your musical horizons, and you decided to move in a different direction, which required getting a new drummer.
That's right.
In the book, you talk about the audition process of that finally led to one Neil Peart. And you talk about how when he, come on. I could talk about Neil all night, but there was.
I think they could listen to you talk about Neil.
Well, it's so great because you perfectly described, like, he shows up in a Pinto.
Yeah.
He has a Rogers drum set. That was my first drum set, was a Rogers. Two 18-inch kick drums. An 18-inch kick is like that's a jazz size.
Yeah.
So, and like your first impression of Neil was like, who's this dorky guy, like walking in with his double kick Rogers kit. But you loved him immediately.
Well, he came in, he set up this kit, and he's tall, he's a tall guy, and he wasn't wearing a shirt, and his hair was all greasy and short, and Alex and I go, who's this fucking goof? And we were just kind of chuckling, and he sat behind the throne after setting up his drums, and he just started playing triplets with his double bass drums, which was like, okay, this guy's not a goof. This guy can fucking play. So my jaw dropped when I heard him just warming up. And from the warm-up, I knew I was not letting this guy go. But Alex and I had talked about it beforehand, and he didn't want us to make any decision until we heard every drum. But come on. Come on! It's Neil effing Peart playing out of his mind. And so we played through our first album songs, and then we pulled out this piece of music that was in 7/8 that our previous drummer did not want anything to do with, and he just locked in, and it was just like magic. So I had this shit-eating grin on my face, and Alex was all fucking pissy. So after the audition, like I was just so excited, and we started talking about books. Like he loved Tolkien, we loved Tolkien. He loved Monty Python's Flying Circus. We loved Monty Python's Flying Circus. We just got along great. But Alex wouldn't say a fucking word. All I was getting was side eye from the guy the whole time. And then when Neil thought that he had blown it because the guitar player didn't like him. And then the next guy came in, and he'd written some charts out for our songs, and he was playing like this, and it was okay. But would you want to be the guy to follow Neil Peart?
No.
So during that, Alex is looking at me, okay, yeah. So we hired him the next day, and it was my 21st birthday, so it was the best birthday present I could ever have gotten.
In the book, Neil talks about how he liked the raw material of
That's right.
of Rush at that audition, you know, and which tells me that he saw the potential in you guys. And, you know, and you put him right to work. Like, you guys had gigs.
Yeah, we had a tour in the offing like 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
We had to get our shit together real fast.
And you guys made 2 records in 1975
Yeah.
with Neil. First song on Fly By Night, Anthem, is a time signature near and dear to my heart, 7/8.
And that's the piece of music that we jammed on.
That's right.
Yeah, it became Anthem.
Well, and that's the first song on the first record that Neil plays on. And I compare that to, you know, Led Zeppelin 1, when we first hear John Bonham playing Good Times, Bad Times. Like, we hear that, the triplet kick drum thing, and we hear Neil play Anthem, which made a huge impression on me as a kid. You know, you guys, like, you and Alex sounded amazing, like you guys were so tight, but Neil brought that tune up, or that tune up to, like, you know, a level. Can you just talk about how you guys felt when you heard the playback for that session? And in the book you talk about, like, going back and listening to some of these albums, and Fly By Night was one that you felt really held up. And I think Caress of Steel, like, holds up really fucking good too. It's so, like,
That was the Weird album.
that's a weird album. And you talk about playing that for Paul Stanley, and
Yeah.
and he wanted to leave the room or something. But,
No, I never forget playing it for Paul, because we were touring with Kiss, and we played Caress of Steel for Paul, and he was just looking at the speakers, not looking at us, looking at the speakers, and I knew he was thinking, what the fuck is this? Okay, he didn't get it, that's fine. You know, anyway, yeah, so, you know, for me, as a bass player, to be partnered up with a drummer of that caliber, and John Rutsey was a very good drummer. I mean, not to take anything away from him.
of course.
He was a very good drummer. And the reasons he ended up leaving the band were complicated, because, you know, he was diabetic and he was always worried about his health. He had to inject insulin every day, and I think he was a bit afraid of success and a bit afraid of the rigors of the road. But at the same time, he loved drummers like Simon Kirke, you know, John Bonham. John was a flashier drummer than John Bonham was a flashier drummer than John Rutsey aspired to be, yet he was, you know, so effing solid. But when you get an opportunity to fulfill your dreams of complexity with a drummer that can really handle that, as you know, you're a drummer, you know that vibe. When you connect with a bass player, it's an unbreakable bond. So for me, it was the birth of what I call the hyperactive rhythm section, because we both wanted to play more notes than was tasteful to play. We didn't worry about being tasteful.
Well, it definitely left a huge impression on me and a lot of us in this room tonight. Those early records with Neil. You also talk about his contribution in lyric writing. Bytor and the Snow Dog was one that you talked about. And when I first heard that song, I was like, what the fuck is a Bytor and the Snow Dog? What does it mean? And you described it in your book. Thank you for
my pleasure. I mean, it was not a popular song with our record company, because, you know, they thought they had signed the next Bachman-Turner Overdrive or the next Bad Company.
Right.
And all of a sudden we're writing a 10-minute song about dogs fighting in space. So, that's exactly what they bargained for. And then Caress of Steel, was our first attempt at a concept album. So, The Fountain of Lamneth, what the fuck is that? They didn't know.
The song rules.
Yeah, so by the time we had finished that Caress of Steel tour, we had bonded as players, we had bonded as friends, we were so tight, but our gigs were getting worse and worse because Caress of Steel was a weird record and it wasn't getting any airplay, so we were convinced that that would be the end of us. And we had another record to go in to do in 1976, and we had to do a lot of soul searching as to what kind of record we'd make. Would we cave into the pressures of management and record company, or would we just say fuck it? Yeah. So thankfully we just said fuck it.
Yeah, that was a huge record. That was a huge record for me personally, and just like so many Rush fans. Like we dove into that record, man. 2112 was just like it was a lightning rod moment for your band, obviously. But you know what? You guys stuck to your guns, man. You did exactly what you needed to do to develop musically. And in the book, you talk about like in the early days, you said yes to every like opening slot that was offered to you because you're trying to get your name out there and get an audience. But at one point, like you talk about like the power of saying no and sticking to your guns. Can you just talk about that a little bit and how it's so important for an artist to like develop and find themselves just by saying no to?
Yeah, I've always believed that the most important word to learn as a young artist is the word no, because you get so much pressure to be what someone else wants you to be. And that's not necessarily going to make you happy. And I know musicians that have compromised on their musical dreams, and then the record is not a success. And then they have nothing, But if you stick to your guns and rightly or wrongly do the record or the music you want to do, if it fails, okay, you have the satisfaction of having made the record you wanted to. But if it succeeds, you win on both counts, And so that's what happened with 2112. It showed all these people that, we could do that same kind of music, but people would actually like it. And it bought us a hall pass. It really did. And they said, well, we don't understand what the fuck you're doing, but just keep doing it. And so we did. And we did that for the rest of our career, really.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that.
And at that time, your audience grew because of that, that ability to just stick to your guns and follow your passion. I saw the Farewell to Kings tour in 1977 at San Diego Sports Arena, and I was heavily into 2112. My buddy and I went to that concert, and I was waiting for this fill that Neil does in the Temples of Syrinx. 4 minutes, 38 seconds roughly into that tune. He does a fill that hit home so hard with me. Mm-hmm. And Neil's, it seemed like at that time Neil's playing was very parts driven. He came up with these parts that he didn't always stray from, but he really composed his parts. Yes.
And he tuned, like, this, the way a drummer tunes his drums is really key. And because he used a lot of those concert toms, and he had a really impeccable taste in tuning his drums. So when he started on the high concert toms, and I'm sure it's one of those kind of riffs.
That's the fill, yeah.
It's like,
concert toms.
It's so musical. And so he looked at writing his drum parts, and I'm sure you have a similar attitude, but he looked at them very much as compositions, and he wouldn't repeat a fill. He would not repeat the same fill in the same song. No effing way. And so that's contagious, that kind of thinking, you know. So I go, oh, I love that. You know, okay, no, not doing the same fill, but it's really good fill. Maybe you should do it twice. No, I'm not doing it twice. Once is enough. Okay, so that means I get to play a different bass fill, and I like that. So we got along real good. Once I understood that was his mode, it was like, great, more crap for me to play. So yeah, but he was that kind of mind, and very compositionally oriented when he structured his drum parts.
Well, the Rush songs are, they're so amazing. You describe.
I love that
guy. You described him in the book as dense, but I think you were able to bridge that gap of, like, you know, prog rock and 70s radio rock in a way that was digestible for the you know, the average music listener back then, and that's just a testament to your songwriting ability, but also your instrumental prowess. You talk about, like, you weren't necessarily a singles-driven band, but you know, there were some songs that were just sounded amazing on the radio. The Spirit of Radio was one of them. You know, and the intro interplay between you and Neil on that song really hits home with me. It's so precise and so musical, but it's really uniquely, you know, your own thing. Like no other band was doing that at the time.
Well, when we got to that period, we had just finished a lot of, you know, we just finished Hemispheres, and so it was our second, thank you. We had now done a few sidelong pieces, and we really felt like we were starting to predict where we would go with these sidelong pieces, and we really wanted to shake it up. And there were all these new rhythmic influences happening, like, you know, the Police were out, and ska music and reggae music was seeping in everywhere. You heard more Bob Marley on the radio, and keyboards were starting to be a thing. And so I was really interested in that, much to Alex's chagrin. But, and so there was all this technology at our fingertips, you know, and so we thought, well, let's try to make our music as complex as we can, but let's not do it in 20 minutes. Let's try to do it in 7 or 10 minutes, you know, a little, somewhat shorter. It didn't help us at radio. I mean, radio still wanted 3.5-minute songs, and we just didn't know how to do that. So we didn't. But Spirit of Radio, the initial riff was Alex's, of course, because he's the riff master of the universe. And he came up with this brilliant cyclical riff, and we just said, you just keep playing that riff, and Neil and I are going to figure out something really, you know, that cuts through it. Yeah. And we wanted that song to represent almost as many styles of music that you'd hear on the radio as possible, like someone who was just flipping the dial. And so I don't know whether we achieved it or not, but it was really fun to put together, and it gave us a different kind of concept, you know.
It was achieved. It was achieved, absolutely. Well, you know, another song that was a great radio song was Tom Sawyer.
Right.
And I think that's a song where you were really, you know, that's where the mini mode was introduced in your music, and it had so many different elements to it. I read an interview once where Neil was talking about how, you know, if he plays that song, you know, to his standard live, then that's going to be a good concert. You know? Yeah. His standards were so high. And you know, there's a video of you guys in Lay Studio playing that song, and can you just talk about how that song came together, and you know, and then eventually how you did like incorporate more keyboards into the band?
Well, that song was one of the hardest songs we ever recorded for a number of reasons. We just had nothing about that song was easy to do. And I'll be honest with you, at one point I was thinking, I don't know, man, if this song's gonna make it on the record. Because it's just so effing difficult to get it down. Every sound we tried, like I tried recording my Rickenbacker bass on that, and it just wouldn't work. Because of how fast that dano part is, it just sounded all clicky. So I needed something that had a bit more guts, and that's the first time, well, maybe not the first time, but the most famous time I pulled out my Fender Jazz bass. And many people think that's a Rickenbacker on that song, but it's not, it's a Fender Jazz. And then Alex went to record the lead solo for it, and it could not sit in this track. There was something so unusual about the way we had recorded it, with the keyboard line that was playing in the middle section, that we couldn't find a space for his guitar sound. And Paul Northfield finally came up with this brilliant idea that he mic'd the speakers and sent them back out to another amp and then brought it back in. And it created this interesting air around the solo, and it just all fell into place. And so, yeah, it was just one of those songs I thought, this is a loser song, it's not gonna work. Can you imagine if we'd left that, our most popular song, off of that album? God, I told you I was an idiot. Yeah, so that, you know, from the moment we recorded the intro to 2112, the synthesizer kind of opened my eyes. When I watched Hugh Syme do that ARP, on a little ARP synthesizer, create that sound space, it just sent a signal to my brain about possibilities that you could bring into our hard rock band. You know, we were trying to be more progressive, and maybe this was a way of adding more melody, more music to our music. And so I went down that rabbit hole, and if anyone knows me, that rabbit holes are me. So I had to learn about them, and that was a very exciting period for synthesizer development, keyboard development. Every 3 months there was a new toy you had to have and check out the sounds. And so I got a little carried away, so for 3 or 4 or 5 albums. But it was a challenge, and the other guys embraced it, you know. Eventually, of course, Al got very, you know, being the guy who just, you know me, Geddy, just go along with it. So he just went along with the keyboard thing, and I didn't realize at the time that he was harboring some real resentment, especially when we went to record Power Windows, because we brought someone else in to be the main keyboardist, this incredibly talented guy, Andy Richards, who used to do all of Trevor Horn's records. And this was the first time we'd worked with Peter Collins, and Al didn't really know Peter, and he didn't know how much he could trust Peter, and he knew his reputation as a guy who worked with a lot of session guys. So he got very insecure about his role, and Andy Richards comes in, and he's playing all this amazing stuff. He filled up the tracks with keyboards. And Alex is sitting in his room trying to figure out his parts, going, where do I fit into this scheme of things here? But of course, he wrote some absolutely brilliant parts, like the parts he wrote for Mystic Rhythms, for example, or The Big Money. I mean, that's a guitar song.
Totally.
So he still had his moment to shine, but I think, you know, in subsequent records, he was starting to harbor some resentment, and it came to blow. We talked about that too when I interviewed him. It's very forthcoming that night, I have to tell you.
Well, it's important for bands to develop, try to change their sound, try to, you know, bring in, you know, different elements that will help the overall sound. And, you know, my background is just more like, you know, guitar riffs, riff rock, which I think you guys and Alex, you know, is an absolute master at.
Yeah.
The riffs that Rush wrote were what I consider like glorious riffs. Like you guys had so many amazing ideas. And in the 80s, it seems like you were definitely trying to change it up a little bit, and it seems like in the 80s you were making a record almost every year. In the book you talk about how you're really trying to balance your career and your family life, and just how difficult that was, around that period.
It was really hard in that period because we were making a lot of records, and the thing was that after Signals was a difficult record to make because we had brought the keyboards to be kind of a fourth member of the band, and that was the first time we approached that whole idea. And Al was all for it, and Neil, of course, was all for it, but we were starting to be able to predict the comments that Terry Brown, our long-standing producer and our mentor, he really was our mentor. He taught us about the stereo spectrum, and he taught us to look at the speaker space, between the speaker space, not just as a musical landscape, but a visual landscape, and to try to organize the sounds to create some sort of picture to the listener who's sitting between those speakers. So it was incredibly important. I learned so much from him, we all did. But when you start to be able to predict what your producer's going to tell me, if you've had this experience, when you know what the producer's going to tell you before he tells you it, it's time to move on because you're not learning anymore, right? You're just going by rote. So we felt determined that we needed fresh input, and it was very difficult to say goodbye to him. I mean, of course, I talk about it in the book. It was very tough, but we had to strike out on our own and find a new producer. So that was all part and parcel of what was going on in that period and what led us to these changes, these big changes. So it was a critical moment. Of course, it all went horribly wrong because the producer that we had hired for Grace Under Pressure, who 2 weeks earlier had been totally excited to do it and had, said he was committed to doing it. We started writing songs, and then we got a phone call that he was going to do Simple Minds instead of our record. So it was like, oh, really? So that's how it's like. That's what it's like out in the real world. The producers are full of shit. Terry never would have done that. So it was a big lesson that not everyone has a sense of honor and sticks to their word. So we were in a panic situation, and we had to do the best we could. Now, so your original question was, how did that impact our home lives? And it was putting a lot of pressure because I was obsessed with finding the right producer, and we were all feeling very desperate. But at the same time, I now had a child at home, and we were living in the country, and it was a tough adjustment for my wife, and so it was sort of the beginning of what I considered to be me being blinded to the needs of my family and putting the band ahead of that. And it's a period that I regret in retrospect, of course, but I couldn't see that at the time. So everything was about the search for this producer. And we finally found this producer in Peter Henderson, who had done a bunch of records with Supertramp, and he made some gorgeous records. And he was a great engineer, but not really a very decisive human. So, we found ourselves recording This An Early Warning. I tell the story in the book, and so we go in the studio, and the three of us are playing together, and we do a take of Just An Early Warning, and we wait for the producer's voice to tell you, "Great guys, it was really great. Let's try one more." Okay, that's normal. We try one more. We try another. Do a few on tape. "How was that, Peter? Why don't you come in and have a listen?" Okay, go in and have a listen. We listen back, and the sounds are incredible. I mean, he's a great engineer. Yeah. And you say, okay, do you think we have it in one of these takes? And he would just sort of go, well, yeah, I think so. Why don't you go out and do a couple more? Okay, I'll go ahead and do a couple more. And we go out and we're playing, and then this was the pattern. He wouldn't really commit.
No commitment. Yeah.
You know, with Terry, you do a take, and you know this feeling. You want the producer to say, that's it, boys, you nailed it. That was never said.
Right.
And so it's like, suddenly we're reeling, going, okay, what's happening here? We have a producer that needs to be produced. So we had to take the role of saying, is this the one? Do you think this is the one? Yeah, I think it's the one. Okay, don't get excited. Now, don't get too excited. Can you imagine doing that session and you don't hear that?
Yeah, well, and then you're second guessing yourself.
Yeah.
When you're trying to, create the best performance in the studio, if someone else isn't hearing what you're hearing, then that can just be an exhausting experience.
Oh, it was totally nerve-wracking. And we spent ages making that record, and it was winter, and I was away from the family, and I had a young kid at home, and it was just like a nightmare, really, by the time we finished it. And he was like that when it came to mixes, too. You know how tough mixing is. Like, there's an expression that I used to, that's from the movie Annie Hall. I don't know if you guys, you're probably too young to know that. But there's a line he uses where he talks about marriage. He says, marriage is the death of hope. Well, I used to say mixing is the death of hope. Because, because you dream of this song, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. You dream of the perfect song. And in your head, it's all possible. And when you come to mix it, you learn what is not possible. What you think you had doesn't always add up to the vision you had in your mind. But that's rock and roll, right?
Yeah.
So the mixing was very difficult, and he couldn't make decisions. So we were doing mix with guitar up, mix with vocal up, mix with keyboards down, and then you'd have to go through and listen to all and pick the right one and edit between them. It was just like, just shoot me, please. So it was really a terrible experience.
Too many options.
Too many options.
Yeah.
And our first experience away from Terry Brown, so really not off to a rockin' start. But thankfully, the record sounds great, I think, still.
Yes.
You guys like it, but we got what we were after, but God, it took a lot to get.
A lot of work.
Geddy, pardon me. The woman in the 7th row appears to be having a baby. Could you move it along, please? Wrap it up now.
Wow. God has a British accent.
7th row.
Yes. I guess they want me to move on to do a reading.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think it's time. Thank
All
you.
right. Let me read something. Well, I was going to read all about the day Neil Peart joined the band, but we already talked about that. So I'm going to read. I know what I'm going to read. Let's talk about my voice. or let's not and say we did. I liked singing from a young age, and I wasn't insecure about it. I sang in the choir for a short time in public school, and later, when I did my bar mitzvah haftorah, I was told I had a beautiful voice. You should be a cantor, my mom's friends would say. No thanks. At that point, I wasn't screaming like the damned howling in Hades, as my reputation would later have it. I would soon be singing cream songs and blues songs in a sort of tenor soprano, or if you prefer, a soprano castrato style. I was a fan of guys with a higher range, like Steve Marriott in The Small Faces and Humble Pie. Humble Pie's Live at the Fillmore was a hugely influential record to me and to most of my peers. I Don't Need No Doctor was a huge song to me, and you can hear its influence. Yeah, it's a great song, right? You can hear its influence in my early singing with Rush. I would later often be compared to Robert Plant, and while he certainly pushed me into higher registers, I think a comparison with Marriott is a bit more accurate.
Nice.
He had a soulful voice with a strong vibrato, but he rocked. Soon, John Anderson's mellifluous singing would affect me too. He had a high range, but his voice wasn't scratchy or abrasive. It was beautiful, soulful, and emotive, and not unlike a schoolboy chorister. I really wanted to sing like that. Another singer who impressed me was Roger Hodgson on the early Supertramp records.
Of course.
And I liked both Paul Simon and Joni Mitchell a lot. Through the years, of course, there were many others. I was a huge fan of Bjork later on in life. And no one would think to make that connection. But there are certain words I sing in Rush in a very Bjork-like manner. But I'm not going to tell you what those are. You got to find them for yourself. I wasn't aiming for raspiness. I just responded intuitively. Where my voice went was out of necessity, relating to what we were writing and the key we were writing it in. And when we were young, we weren't too savvy about keys. If the key we wrote a song in felt right, my vocals would just have to make do. What we came to learn was that in certain lower registers, my voice had little power. But when I booted it up an octave, there was the power. Watching the movie Coda recently, I was struck by the scene in which the choir teacher tries to bring out his students' inner frustrations, coaxing her to sing from the gut. She's the only hearing member of a deaf family. Even if it's an ugly sound, he says, it will feel good. Turn your angst into power. And it dawned on me that my earliest vocal style may also have been rooted in my childhood, listening to stories of what my parents had endured in the concentration camps, suffering that bullying and alienation, so that when I began to sing, it all came rushing out like a screaming banshee. I was releasing all those suppressed emotions just by stepping up to the mic and screaming, yeah! Ah, yeah! Of course, then I had to learn how to actually sing. John Griffin once wrote in the Montreal Gazette that I sounded like a guinea pig with an amphetamine habit. In Circus magazine, Dan Nuger said, if Lee's voice were any higher and raspier, his audience would consist exclusively of dogs and extraterrestrials. I kind of like that one. And in 1979, perhaps kindlier, John Rockwell would comment in the New York Times, Mr. Lee sings in a spare but unusual way, a brittle and androgynous tenor. Thank you, I think. So yes, my style did come across to some as quite abrasive, especially before we began making records. But you have to put yourself back in 1974. It's all context, right? In 2023, our collective ears have become much more open. We've heard every style of music, every kind of singer, bands way heavier than Rush, vocalists even shriekier than I used to be. So imagine you're a critic back then in a reverberant arena, and there's this three-piece band you don't know, and this hairy guy is shouting at you. I get that if you consider yourself more sophisticated than the average music fan, our 26 minutes on stage must have seemed a loud mess. But we were truly into it. Playing our parts with honest conviction, and raw or not, we were connecting with a growing number of people. I guess sometimes the official tastemakers are the last to know. Each new Rush album gave me another opportunity to improve as a player and a songwriter, but especially as a singer. It likely became so important to me because of all the heat I took for my voice over the years. Sometimes my attitude was like, hey, you don't like the way I sing? Well then, I politely invite you to fuck the fuck off and move along to something more suitable to your sensitive taste. But most often, to meet my own standards, if no one else's, I worked at it and I worked hard. And then there's singing with a cold. There is really nothing worse than going out on stage in that condition, becoming hoarse, singing badly, and unable to hit the notes. And I did it far too many times. That's a special kind of torture. With our show must go on attitude, we resisted canceling gigs unless it was absolutely unavoidable. And I'd go on stage with tonsillitis, croup coughs, and even a bloody nose, swallowing blood, and with this nose, that's a lot of blood. And feeding a spittoon throughout the show. When I was sick, my bass tech Scully would also keep a shit ton of Kleenex and a wastebasket at the side of the stage and run out between songs with hot tea, lemon, and honey. One time, my ears became so congested that my trusty ENT doctor in Toronto had to puncture one of my eardrums to drain the fluid out, simply so I could fly to the next gig. When flying on tour, you see, during decompression at altitude, the fluid in your sinus cavities can become excruciatingly painful and leave you partially deaf for days. And that's a whole lot of fun. So I screamed blue murder when he inserted that needle. And then leaving his office, I noticed a young kid in the waiting room, pale as a ghost, staring at me in horror. And I said with a wink, "You're up, kid." Thank you very much. My friend Matt and I are going to take a short break. Then we'll come back to answer all of your questions and more. And in the meanwhile, we're going to show you a little film that tells you what else I've been up to. So thank you very much.
Knock, knock. Anybody home? Welcome to a different kind of music show. I'm trying to show the world that a bass player can do many things. Absolutely. That covers all the bases.
I feel like bass playing is so easy.
Don't say that. Join me, Geddy Lee, singer and bass guitarist of the band Rush,
Hello.
as I travel to the homes of 4 bass legends and dive deep into their lives.
Off we go. Wow, this is intense.
I'm full of surprises, my friend. And their inspirations.
Canning is a lot like playing the bass guitar.
After you do a fine bass part, it's in the can. Plus some fun making music. Now that's effing magic. As I try to answer one really important question. Are bass players human too?
Yes, I believe so.
14 years old, if I could have imagined the day when I'd be helping Geddy Lee off with his coveralls, I would have myself.
Is this what they call good TV?
Geddy Lee asks, are bass players human too? New docuseries streaming December 5th.